Although it's been 200 years since Jean-François Champollion deciphered the hieroglyphs and pioneered a new body of study known as Egyptology, a fundamental question remains highly debated. That is, which race were the ancient Egyptians? After 200 years of intense excavations and thorough study of ancient Egyptian monuments, texts, and mummies, modern scholars still haven't reached a consensus on this question. So one might ask, well, why haven't they reached a consensus? Isn't Egypt in Africa, so there must have been black Africans, right? Well, although the geographical location of ancient Egypt and its archaeological documents point toward a black African ancient Egypt, the majority of modern scholars since the creation of the field of Egyptology have been arguing against this hypothesis for now 2 centuries, and many of those arguments are simply fallacious or flat-out racist, yet at the same time embraced and accepted by the Egyptologists community. That is why in this video we are going to expose the lack of intellectual honesty of the Egyptologists when discussing this question. So if you want to know about these arguments full of funny comments and interesting conclusions, stick around till the end of the video. Quick disclaimer, the quotations I present here were chosen according to how relevant I thought them to be. If you want to know more about this topic, I invite you to go do some further research. All the scholars I will refer to in this video will be referenced in the description below. Alright, without further ado, let's jump into this video. So what have the modern scholars and Egyptologists said about this issue? Why is it still a debate? Before we answer these questions, we must first know a bit about the history of this issue. We already saw in a previous video that the ancient Greeks who described the ancient Egyptians almost unanimously said that they were black complexioned. Those same texts informed European scholars of the 1700s, who then ended up reaching the consensus that the population of ancient Egypt was black African. Such scholars included Abbé Henri Grégoire, a French eminent scholar, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, a German anthropologist, Constantin de Volney, another eminent French scholar whom we mentioned in a previous video that you can go check out on my channel, and so many others. The few who were opposing the consensus at the time were mainly American scholars, and I presume we can all guess why. I mean, it was the 1700s. Most Americans believed Africans were something in between the ape and the man. So of course they opposed it when these European scholars brought forth undeniable evidence about Egypt being of black origin. Such evidence included anthropological evidence, ancient sources accounts such as the Greeks and the Romans, investigations on site, etc. So this was how the European scientific community of the 1700s came to the consensus that ancient Egypt was of black origin. Hence, one can see here that this debate is not at all new, and that it is not the Afrocentrists who started to claim that Egypt was black. It was the European scholars of the European Age of Reason who did. So if you didn't know, now you know. So how did this view come to change over the past 2 centuries? It all started with the brother of the father of Egyptology, Jacques-Joseph Champollion Figeac, who argues against ancient Egypt being black in a book called Histoire Ancienne. In English, that would be Ancient Egypt. Champollion Figeac opposed this view despite the conclusion his brother, the father of Egyptology, reached after examining several ancient Egyptian monuments in Egypt, that is, that the Egyptians were akin to the modern Ethiopians and other Africans further south. Nonetheless, without having set foot in Egypt himself, Champollion Figeac simply opposed his brother's view and the consensus by presenting quite the questionable argument. Here is how he argues. The opinion that the ancient population of Egypt belonged to the Negro African race is an error long accepted as truth since the Renaissance. Travelers in the East, barely capable of fully appreciating the ideas provided by ancient Egyptian monuments on this important question, have helped to spread that false notion, and geographers have not failed to reproduce it even in our day. A serious authority declared himself in favor of this view and popularized the error. Such was the effect of what the celebrated Volney published on the various races of men that he had observed in Egypt. He concludes that the Egyptians were true Negroes of the same species as all indigenous Africans. To support his opinion, Volney invokes that of Herodotus, who, apropos the Caucasians, recalls that the Egyptians had black skin and woolly hair. Yet these two physical qualities do not suffice to characterize the Negro race, and Volney's conclusion as to the Negro origin of the ancient Egyptian civilization is evidently forced and inadmissible. So I'm gonna be changing my voice like that. It's just to have fun while we're doing this, it's all very serious. Oh, this man argues this man argues that. Come on. Alright, okay. Great. So here is a guy who hasn't actually been to Egypt refuting what experts on the Orient said about what they had thoroughly examined. Wow. I mean, this man here didn't actually examine the same monuments he claims others were not fully able to appreciate. The audacity. It's incredible. This includes his brother and the Count de Volney, whom Champollion Figeac claims was a serious authority on this subject. This man even goes as far as to say that black skin and woolly hair are not sufficient descriptors for black people. Okay, this is ridiculous. For this dude, you could be black from head to toe, and he would still not call you black if you were from ancient Egypt. The man is obviously repulsed by the idea that black people would have been at the origin of the greatest ancient civilization ever. Remember, this is the imperial European era. Things like the Code Noir were in vigor in France. The Code Noir was a set of laws that considered black people as property or an object that can feel no pain, less than chattel. So it's that era. Go do your research on the Code Noir, instituted by Napoleon Bonaparte. Really, really evil stuff. Anyhow, all this to say that this man Champollion was adherent to the great and superior white race nonsense. Anyhow, let's continue to read his argumentation to see what he means by black skin and woolly hair are not sufficient descriptors for black people. It is recognized today that the inhabitants of Africa belong to three races, quite distinct from each other for all time. 1. Negroes proper in Central and West Africa. 2. Kafirs on the East Coast, who have a less obtuse facial angle than blacks and a high nose, thick lips, and woolly hair. 3. Moors, similar in stature, physiognomy, and hair to the best formed nations of Europe and Western Asia, and differing only in skin color, which is done by the climate. The ancient population of Egypt belongs to this latter race, that is, to the white race. To be convinced of this, we need only examine the human figures representing Egyptians on the monuments, and above all, the great number of mummies that have been opened, except for the color of the skin, blackened by the hot climates. They are the same men as those of Europe and Western Asia. Frizzy woolly hair is the true characteristic of the Negro race. The Egyptian, however, had long hair, identical with that of the white race of the West. Best formed nations of Europe. Wow, dude. Okay, we can tell what what he believed, right? So it supports my previous idea about him believing that white people were better. I told you that these were interesting arguments. Three races that have always been different because of the climate. Do you now understand what he meant by black skin and woolly hair are not sufficient to characterize black people? To this dude, blacks are only West Africans and Bantu people. The others are not black. To him, we are completely unrelated, both phenotypically and genetically. Well, of course, that is all complete nonsense. That view is simply false, and it has been proven so. Mind you, this view is still present today with some Egyptologists. They say the Egyptians weren't true blacks, meaning what Champollion just said. Here is an example of someone in my comment section claimed that he's an Egyptologist, he knows what he's talking about, and he said Egyptians weren't true blacks. This, of course, is nonsense, since anthropologists don't divide the races like that. Anthropologists only know three races. And what's more, mitochondrial DNA shows that all Africans are from the same haplogroup. Whether you live in the north, in the south, in the west, or in the east, we're all related, we all come from the same nucleus. So Champollion's classification of the races is a fairy tale. Therefore, his conclusions do not stand. Also, his conclusion on the mummy's skin turning black because of the heat is another fairy tale. Nothing attests to what he says, except himself. Actually, you find that Egyptian mummies have varying colors. You find black mummies with black skin, and then you find the ones with brown skin. And what's more is that mummies in China have white skin. They have pale skin, which tells you if the mummies in Egypt have a black skin, that might be because the living people also had black skin or a lot of melanin in them, which is actually a study Dr. Diop did and found a lot of melanin content in the skin of the mummies. So again, Champollion's theory of the mummy's skin blackening because of the hot weather does not stand. Lastly, this man Champollion Figeac ends up contradicting his own previous statement about the characteristics of black people when he says that frizzy woolly hair is the true characteristic of black people. The true characteristic of black people. So, at one point it isn't, and then it is again. I mean, this man is hilarious. And he even concludes that Egyptians were white people. Yeah, white people with black skin. Fairy tales. This view is utterly untenable today, of course, given the evidence we have. And again, I'm not the only person who has noticed all these issues in the arguments of the precursor of the non-black Egypt hypothesis. Here is Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop brilliantly exposing Champollion Figeac's incoherence. Finally, after stating that black skin and woolly hair do not suffice to characterize the Negro race, Champollion Figeac contradicts himself 36 lines later by writing, "Frizzy woolly hair is the true characteristic of the Negro race." He goes so far as to say that the Egyptians had long hair and that, consequently, they belonged to the white race. It would appear from that text that the Egyptians were whites with black skin and long hair. Though we may be unaware of the existence of such whites, we can try to see how the author reached that conclusion. What has been said about Ethiopians and Copts shows that their hair may be less frizzy than that of other Negroes. Moreover, a black, completely black race with long hair exists. The Dravidians, considered Negroes in India and whites in Africa. Champollion Figeac goes even further, saying this. Lengthy wars had brought Egypt into contact with the African interior. Thus, one distinguishes on Egyptian monuments several species of blacks, differing among themselves in the principal features that modern travelers have listed as dissimilarities, either with respect to complexion, which makes Negroes black or copper-colored, or with respect to other features no less typical. This passage shows that he hadn't been to Egypt himself. His own brother, an expert on Egypt, observed the monuments where Egyptians and Nubians were represented, and he could not escape the fact that they were represented in the same way, except for their clothing. We also discussed this in a previous video that you can again find on my channel. What is even more hilarious is that Figeac himself ends up concluding the same thing by citing the research of a doctor who had been to Egypt. He too concluded that the Egyptians were similar to the Abyssinians, that is, today's Ethiopian populations, therefore black Africans. Here is the passage. Dr. Larry investigated this problem in Egypt. He examined a large number of mummies, studied their skulls, recognized the principal characteristics, tried to identify them in the various races living in Egypt, and succeeded in doing so. The Abyssinians seemed to him to combine them all, except for the black race. The Abyssinians has large eyes, an agreeable glance, prominent cheekbones. The cheeks form a regular triangle, with the prominent angles of the jawbone and mouth. The lips are thick without being everted as in blacks. The teeth are fine, just slightly protruding. Finally, the complexion is merely copper-colored. Such are the Abyssinians, observed by Dr. Larry, and generally known as Berbers or Barabras, present-day inhabitants of Nubia. Lol, Champollion is a funny man. First of all, this doctor gives a bunch of unnecessary descriptors, right? Such as an agreeable glance and all that shit. It's unnecessary. These are not scientific terms. What is an agreeable glance, man? Anyhow, he ends up admitting that the Abyssinians that he's describing as the people that would be closest to the ancient Egyptians have a copper-colored skin. Remember, Champollion himself said Negroes are copper-colored skin. So, again, You can't go to Egypt, examine the archaeological artifacts, and come to the conclusion that they weren't of brown skin. That's just not stating the facts. Anyhow, notice that he mentions that they were known as Berbers or Barabras. That is again another confusion. I don't know if it's an honest confusion or a willing one. The Berbers they're referring to here are not the Amazigh population of North Africa. These are the Nubians, the Ethiopians. They used to call them Barabras. You can go look it up. The Berbers or Barabras. The Barabras are modern day Ethiopians. So Egyptians were similar to the Ethiopians, according to the same man who was arguing earlier that they were white people. Wow. And this is the evidence he brings. This is the same man who was saying they were white. I mean, he considered the Ethiopians to be non-black. He calls them kafir. They are between black and white. Nonsense. Of course, nonsense. Ethiopians are black people. We have the same features. Of course, theirs are slightly different, but we are still black Africans. Anyhow, let's continue. The next quotations are from Salvatore Cherubini, the son of a famous Italian composer of the same name, who accompanied Champollion the Young, not to be confused with Champollion Figeac. Champollion Figeac was the older brother of Champollion the Young. So this Cherubini accompanied Champollion the Young on his travels to Egypt, commissioned by Napoleon Bonaparte. So what did Cherubini say about this topic? Here is the quotation. The Egyptians carried their classifications, or more precisely, their racial pride, so far as to establish the most clear-cut distinction between themselves and their native African neighbors, such as the Negro populations, with whom they were loath to be confused, and whom they placed in a separate category. Of course, this is all nonsense. Just another fairy tale this guy came up with in order to distance the ancient Egyptians from what they really were, black Africans. He claims this as if he read it in a papyrus somewhere, but of course he didn't, since his travel companion hadn't deciphered them yet. So all he's stating as if they were facts only come from his own imagination. We already saw that in the tomb of Hui, the Nubians were very similar to the ancient Egyptians in complexion and facial features. You can go check out my video on the tomb of Hui, or go search a clear picture of the complete wall of the tomb of Hui on Google. Okay, Cherubini continues interpreting what he saw by saying, we see King Sesostris returning from an expedition against these southerners. Several captives preceded his chariot. Further on, the monarch offers the local god 2 groups of prisoners, evidently belonging to these savage tribes. These men, roped together, almost stark naked, except for a panther skin about their loins, are distinguished by their color, some entirely black, others dark brown, the long facial angle, the top of the head quite flat, the combination of coarse features, and a generally frail body characterize a special type, a race on the lowest rung of the human ladder. The hideous grimaces and contortions that contract the faces and limbs of these men reveal savage habits. The strangeness of that race, in which the moral sense seems almost non-existent, would tend to place it on a plane more or less intermediate between man and brute. Between men and brutes. These are black Africans. Okay, black African people, these are your ancestors. This man is calling between men and brute, right? So again, that was the general idea of racist people. Black people are between men and beast. Clear evidence of the racist bias reflecting the sentiment of the European population at the time towards black people. Here we've got one obviously racist dude. He projects his own view of the races on the ancient Egyptians, even insulting the Nubians as savages and brutes. A true ignorant clown, yet so bold as to leave his opinion for the scientific community to use it as an argument. Also, he mentioned the coloration of the Nubians. Isn't it funny that when a Nubian has the same coloration as an Egyptian, they eagerly call it dark brown, yet they call it reddish brown when the same color is found on the Egyptians? Simply inconsistent. This guy also uses the now common argument of Egyptians and Nubians fought multiple wars against one another, hence they couldn't have been the same race. This is complete nonsense. That's like saying all wars are fought along racial lines, which it obviously isn't. It's akin to say the English and the French fought a lot. This means the French must have been black or Middle Eastern. Do you hear how ridiculous that sounds? Cherubini also stated that the reddish-brown color of the Egyptians was merely a conventional color to make the Egyptians stand out from other races, thus making the Egyptians an original race. Of course, this is again another fairy tale from his own imagination, since he never actually got any document from ancient Egyptian artists or priests confirming this view. Moreover, nothing on ancient Egyptian wall paintings justifies this interpretation, as Dr. Diop points out here. The reddish-brown color that Champollion called dark red, and which is quite simply Negro-colored, could not be a conventional color as Cherubini suggests. If it were, it would be the only conventional color on the bas-relief, whereas all the others are natural. There is no doubt about the reality of the white clothes worn by the first man, or the flesh-colored bordering on yellow complexion or tanned tint of the third, or the white skin of the most delicate shade, the blonde beard and eyes of the fourth. Among so many natural colors, why should only one be conventional? Even less understandable is that it should be a Negro color rather than any other. This conventional argument is still widely used today. It is the go-to argument when one mentions the skin color of the Egyptians on wall paintings. Well, now you know how to debunk it. No Egyptian document refers to any conventional colors being used. This idea comes from the creative mind of a fairy tale storyteller. Not that he was, it's just that he was good at making up stories. The next modern scholar is Gaston Maspero, a French Egyptologist who basically repeated what Champollion Figeac said, treating it as the ultimate argument that destroyed the idea of a black Egypt. Here is his quote. In our day, the origin and ethnographic affinities of the population have inspired lengthy debate. First, the 17th and 18th century travelers, misled by the appearance of certain mongrelized Copts, certified that their predecessors in the Pharaonic age had a puffed-up face, bug eyes, flat nose, fleshy lips, and that they presented certain characteristic features of the Negro race. This error, common at the start of the century, vanished once and for all as soon as the French Commission had published its great work. Clearly, this guy read that publication with a huge bias, for him not to notice the obvious contradictions that Champollion Figeac makes. No matter, we've got serious scholars like Dr. Diop who are not afraid to critically examine such publications and expose them for what they are. Dr. Diop was not the only one who opposed the then new status quo. Abbé Émile Amelino, a French Egyptologist who lived around the time Champollion Figeac was alive, was another modern scholar who opposed the view that Egyptians weren't black Africans by saying, "From various Egyptian legends, I have been able to conclude that the population settled in the Nile Valley were Negroes, since the goddess Isis was said to have been a reddish-black woman. In other words, as I have explained, her complexion is café au lait, coffee with milk, the same as that of certain other blacks, whose skin seems to cast metallic reflections of copper." I guess some Egyptologist dude would also call this man an Afrocentrist while concluding that the Egyptians were black Africans. Just ludicrous. I mean, you heard these other men before who are arguing for a non-black ancient Egypt. They are all saying that it was a consensus at the time. It had been so for centuries. Europe at the time was adamant on this. Ancient Egypt was black. It was these scholars who came in and said, no, they weren't, no, they weren't. And they were clearly racist. So we can tell why they wanted to change the status quo. They didn't want such a great civilization to be black. But again, as Ben Shapiro likes to say, facts don't care about your feelings. So these scholars were among the few who were arguing against Egypt being black. It was a consensus. They had had multiple debates on this issue, on this question. So it wasn't a new thing. It wasn't black people or Afrocentrists who started saying, Egypt is black, Egypt is ours. No, we didn't even care about this. It was white people who said it. White people who were all about what are the facts. Okay, the facts are pointing to a black Egypt, therefore Egypt must have been black, and Herodotus saw them, so they are black. He said they were black, so they are definitely black people. Let's end the debate. Of course they ended, and then this man came and said, no, they weren't, and he brings these crappy arguments. And then the Egyptologist community was like, yeah, there we go. They're not blacks. They're not the slaves. Wow, it's sad. Anyhow, let's continue. Now let's take a look at how some anthropologists failed to state simple facts and give a clear unbiased statement about their findings of their own investigation. All that just to avoid saying that her findings suggested that pre-dynastic Egypt had a black African population. Here is the quotation. Ms. Fawcett believes that the Nacta crania are sufficiently homogeneous to justify speaking of a Nacta race. By the height of the skull, the auricular height, the height and width of the face, the height of the nose, the cephalic and facial indices, this race presents affinities with Negroes. By the nasal width, the height of the orbit, the length of the plate, the nasal index, it presents affinities with the Germans. In some features, pre-dynastic Nacta probably resembled Negroes. In others, they probably resembled whites. See here that she finds that the population is basically black African. She brings up the fact that the nasal index matches that of the German, meaning that they have narrow noses. Then she goes on to conclude that both populations must have been there. But the other obvious reality is that East Africans have the same narrow noses that one finds common in the Europeans. Should we then say from now on that they are white? Of course not, because their skull and other facial indexes match that of other Africans further south. Another recent modern anthropologist did the same kind of shenanigans when speaking about the results of King Tutankhamun's skull. Here is what she said. Age was easy, she said. The third molars were in the process of coming in, something that happens between the ages of 18 and 20. Race, by contrast, was the hardest call. The shape of the cranial cavity indicated an African, while the nose opening suggested narrow nostrils, a European characteristic. The skull was a North African. She is clearly running away from the obvious. That is, King Tut was akin to the modern-day Ethiopians or Kenyans or Nilotic peoples. North African is just another code word the Egyptologists use to mean Middle Eastern and not Black African. King Tut's representations, as you can see here, show a brown-skinned man with a complexion and facial features quite similar to that of some Ethiopians or Kenyans today. One must have the courage to state facts. But of course, they won't dare to say Egypt was Black African, lest they be called Afrocentrist and cast aside by the Egyptologist community as a pseudo-scientist. Just research Martin Bernal, Teofilo Benga, Cheikh Anta Diop, and so many others who've been cast aside as pseudo-scientists. Then you will understand what I am talking about. Right, now let's see how they managed to spread ideas that were still being debated as known facts, and also discuss why these ideas managed to stay until this day despite them being fallacious. First, they managed to spread their questionable ideas widely through textbooks written by certain authorities on history. An example of this is James Breasted's history textbook, The Conquest of Civilization. James Breasted was a renowned historian in the US. This means his textbooks were widely used in many universities and schools as reference. Here is what Breasted said about the population of ancient Egypt. On the south of the northwest quadrant lay the teeming black world of Africa, separated from the great white race by an impassable desert barrier, the Sahara, which forms so large a part of the southern flatlands. Thus isolated and at the same time unfitted by ages of tropical life for any effective intrusion among the white race, the Negro and Negroid peoples remained without any influence on the development of early civilization. We may then exclude both these external races, the straight-haired, round-headed, yellow-skinned Mongoloid on the list on the east, and the woolly-haired, long-headed, dark-skinned Negroids on the south from any share in the origins or subsequent development of civilization. Oh my days! The Great White Race. Wow. No comment on that one. We can tell this one wasn't probably too eager to debate whether Egypt was Black African or not. He was obviously racist, meaning he believed in the idea that the white race was superior to others. Nonsense scientifically, of course. Yet his book was widely used in schools. Because at the time, sad to say, the US society was itself mostly racist. Nevertheless, the man still tries to bring a reasoning to his conclusion. That is, blacks have always been stuck south of the Sahara Desert. This false idea is still brought up in debates today. This is another fairy tale they made up to remove black people from Egypt. But of course, we can see through the nonsense. First of all, the Nile Valley has always been a corridor out of Africa. Secondly, the Nubians, who were a black civilization, lived in the Nile Valley. Unbeknownst to most, Nubia was actually older than Egypt. But of course, they won't give it the title of older than Egypt because it would then contradict the nonsense this man is talking about here about blacks not having contributed anything to civilization earlier on. We did it through Nubia and we did it through Egypt. Nubia is older than Egypt. So again, Nubians, a black civilization. So clearly they weren't aware, and there is racism to this day. When studying Nubia and discovering facts about Nubia, they are discovering temples, 200 pyramids in Nubia that no one wants to talk about. On mainstream media, the Egyptologists ignore it. They don't want to see the parallels between Nubia and Egypt, the similarities. Nubia and Egypt, the earliest civilization on Earth, too, in Africa. Anyhow, I digress. Let's carry on. And thirdly, North Africa, contrary to popular belief, has indigenous black populations that were there prior to the coming of the Middle Eastern populations. These are very ancient populations who came from the south and migrated to North Africa. This is documented. Do your research. Some of these tribes are the Tebu of Libya and the Drawa of Morocco. I believe you can also find one tribe of black African people in Algeria. So again, a myth that no, they came during the Arab slave trade. Nonsense. Nonsense. These are indigenous tribes. So some of these Egyptologists need to stop lying about North Africa being completely white. It's a big fat lie. And James Breated is not the only example of this. We've got multiple children's books depicting the Egyptians as white, movies portraying the Egyptians as white people, Europeans, with directors saying that they consulted scholars on the question, and high school history books that lighten the skin of the Egyptians, and countless other reconstructions of Egyptian wall paintings that lighten the skin of the Egyptians, and much more. Alright folks, this video is getting too long. I will release its second part shortly. Here I have presented the earlier modern scholars who started inventing stories and making up facts in order to maintain black Africans out of Egypt. Now you know a bit about the history of how this whole started. I hope that you liked this video. If you did, please leave a like or comment. And don't forget to share this video or subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate. In the next video, we will discuss the views of the more recent modern scholars and see if they brought any new arguments supporting their views. So until next time, peace.